The file sat on a desk at Langley for 11 years before anyone was given clearance to open it. Not because it was forgotten. Files like this one don't get forgotten. They get left alone deliberately. The way you leave alone a room in a house where something happened that you haven't yet found the language for. It was catalogued. It was referenced in 3 separate internal reviews. 2 station chiefs requested access and were denied. The analyst who finally received clearance in 2003 later described the experience of reading it as, and these are his words, written in a personal memoir that was itself partially redacted before publication, like being told that the rules of a game you had spent your entire career studying had been changed without anyone telling you. The operation had no official name on the British side. The SAS don't name operations the way other units do, don't construct the mythology around the mission before it has been completed, don't brief journalists or prepare the narrative in advance. It was referred to internally by a single alphanumeric designation that appeared in 3 documents and nowhere else. On the American side, in the CIA's filing system, it was listed under a category that translates roughly as unexplained outcome. There were 11 other files in that category. 10 of them also involved the British SAS. This is what the file contained. It was the autumn of 2001 and Afghanistan was not yet the place it would become. The infrastructure of the American military machine, the forward operating bases, the drone networks, the vast surveillance apparatus that would eventually stretch across the country like a second atmosphere, was still being assembled. Still finding its shape. In those first weeks, the war was being fought by small numbers of men operating in conditions of near total information uncertainty, relying on intelligence that was sometimes days old, sometimes contradictory, sometimes simply wrong. Into this environment, in the second week of October, a 4-man British SAS patrol was inserted by helicopter into a valley in Helmand Province that American intelligence had assessed as, the exact phrase used in the tasking document, extremely high risk with a survival probability for small units rated at below 40%. Below 40%. That assessment was not made carelessly. It was based on signals intelligence, on satellite imagery, on human source reporting from 3 separate networks, on pattern of life analysis conducted over 6 weeks. The valley contained a significant concentration of Taliban fighters. Estimates ranged from 140 to over 200. Depending on which report you read. It had 1 viable approach route and 1 viable exit route, both of which were known to the enemy and almost certainly covered. There were no friendly forces within 40 kilometers. Air support was available in theory and in practice was 45 minutes away, which in a contact situation is a figure that sits in the stomach like a stone. The American assessment was that the mission, as tasked, was not survivable by a 4-man unit. The SAS went anyway. What the CIA analysts knew, and what had brought the file to that particular desk in that particular building, was not that the patrol had gone in. Units go into unsurvivable situations with some regularity, driven by necessity or by the specific quality of will that makes a man volunteer for the kind of work that comes with a below 40% survival rating. What brought the file to Langley was what happened next, or more precisely, what didn't happen, because the patrol went in. And nothing happened. Not in the way that nothing happening means the mission was cancelled or postponed or that the men lay in cover for 3 days and extracted without contact. Nothing happened in a way that the surveillance systems could not account for. The valley, watched from above by American assets, monitored on signals intelligence, tracked through a network of human sources that had been reliable for months. The valley simply continued to function normally, fighter movement patterns unchanged. Radio traffic unchanged. The rhythm of daily life in a Taliban-controlled area, which has its own specific signature that analysts learn to read the way a doctor reads a pulse, continued without interruption or variation. And yet, when the patrol extracted 4 days later, extracted cleanly, on schedule, without contact, without casualties, the intelligence picture that came back with them was so comprehensive, so precise, so granularly detailed that the American analysts who received it spent the better part of a week trying to reconcile it with the surveillance data they had been collecting from above. It didn't reconcile. The patrol had been somewhere. They had seen things and heard things and recorded things that could only be obtained from ground level, from close proximity, from positions inside the valley's defensive perimeter that the American analysis said were not accessible. They had information about specific individuals, specific locations, specific patterns of behavior that no satellite could have provided. They had, in the considered opinion of 3 separate CIA analysts who reviewed the material independently, been inside the enemy's operational space for 4 days in a way that should not have been possible without being detected. And they had not been detected. The patrol's after-action report, classified at a level that meant fewer than 20 people in the British government were authorized to read it, described the 4 days in the valley in the same clipped, factual, emotionally evacuated language that the SAS use for all official documentation. Timings, grid references, observations. Nothing in the language of the report gave any indication that what had been accomplished was in any way remarkable. It read like a routine patrol debrief. It read like a morning's work. The CIA analyst who received the intelligence product, a 15-year veteran of the Directorate of Operations who had worked Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, and 3 other theaters he was not permitted to name, read the patrol's debrief alongside the intelligence it had produced and sat with it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone and called his supervisor. "I need you to tell me," he said, "how 4 men did what the file says they did. Because I've looked at the surveillance data, and I've looked at the ground truth, and I cannot make those 2 things exist in the same valley at the same time." His supervisor was quiet for a moment. "Which regiment?" he asked. The analyst told him. Another silence. "Then I can't help you," his supervisor said, and hung up. The 4 men had inserted at 0200 hours local time from a helicopter that didn't land. Fast rope. 40 feet in the dark, in full kit, into a landing zone that had been selected not because it was good but because it was the least bad option available within the operational radius. The valley floor was 3 kilometers to the east. Between the insertion point and the valley there was a ridgeline, a dry riverbed, and approximately 4 kilometers of ground that the satellite imagery showed as open and exposed and which the Americans had assessed as impassable at night without detection. The patrol crossed it in 90 minutes. That fact alone gave the CIA analyst pause when they reconstructed the timeline afterwards. 90 minutes, in darkness, in full combat equipment, across terrain that the imagery suggested was overlooked by at least 2 known observation posts. The American Special Operations planners who reviewed the route afterwards, men who had spent careers thinking about exactly this kind of movement, came back with a consensus assessment that the crossing should have taken a minimum of 4 hours under ideal conditions, and that ideal conditions did not describe what the patrol had encountered. Nobody asked the patrol how they had done it. That was not how the regiment worked. You tasked them. They delivered. The space between the tasking and the delivery belonged entirely to them, and filling that space with questions was something the SAS tolerated from politicians and endured from Allied liaison officers and regarded with the specific quiet contempt that very competent people reserve for questions that reveal a fundamental misunderstanding of what competence actually means. The patrol commander was a staff sergeant whose name appears in the available documents only as an initial. He had been in the regiment for 9 years. Before that, the parachute regiment. Before that, a comprehensive school in South Wales where, by his own account given in a single interview that was never intended for publication, he had been told at the age of 16 by a careers advisor that he was not university material and should consider a trade. He had considered a trade. By the autumn of 2001, he had conducted more than 40 special operations across 5 theaters. He had been shot twice, neither time seriously enough to require evacuation. He had been mentioned in dispatches once, in a citation that described an action in terms so carefully vague that it conveyed almost no information about what had actually happened. He was, by every metric available to the people who tracked these things, one of the most experienced covert operators in the British order of battle. He was 34 years old. His 3 patrol members were selected for this specific task from a larger squadron element operating in theater. The selection criteria were not recorded in any document the CIA analysts could access, which itself told them something. When you select 4 men from a unit where every man is already exceptional, and you don't write down why you chose those 4, it means the criteria exist in a register that paperwork cannot capture. It means you chose them because of something you know about them that you learned in places and situations that don't have official records. The patrol reached the valley perimeter before first light. What they found there confirmed the intelligence assessment in one respect and contradicted it entirely in another. The fighter concentration was real. If anything, the numbers were higher than the upper estimate. The staff sergeant's own assessment, recorded in his debrief, put the figure at closer to 230. The defensive posture was professional. The observation posts were where the satellite imagery had placed them, manned continuously with overlapping fields of view that covered every logical approach to the valley's interior. Every logical approach. The staff sergeant had spent 3 days before insertion studying the imagery. Not the assessed imagery, the raw imagery, the unprocessed feeds. The data before the analysts had applied their frameworks and their pattern recognition and their accumulated institutional knowledge about how Taliban units organized defensive positions in this specific terrain type. He had looked at the ground the way the ground actually was rather than the way the doctrine said it should be interpreted. He had found something the analysts had not found. He would not describe it in the debrief beyond a single sentence. Terrain exploitation, non-standard approach, details classified at source. The CIA analysts who read that line spent considerable time and energy trying to understand what it meant. The most experienced among them eventually concluded that it meant the staff sergeant had identified a route into the valley's interior that the Taliban defensive position had not accounted for, because the route was one that no conventional military planning process would have identified as viable, which meant it was probably not a route in any recognizable sense. It was probably a series of observations about the ground, a fold here, a dead angle there, a pattern in the sentry rotation that created a window of minutes rather than hours, that added up in the mind of a man who had been doing this for 9 years, to something that could be used. For 4 days, the patrol operated inside the valley. The CIA surveillance assets continued their coverage throughout. The signals intelligence continued its monitoring. The human source network continued its reporting. None of it detected 4 British soldiers moving through the valley's interior, observing, recording, mapping the human terrain of a Taliban operational hub with a granularity that ground-based intelligence alone can provide. On the second day, the patrol passed within 12 meters of a Taliban checkpoint. 12 meters. The staff sergeant recorded this in his debrief with the same flat affect he used for everything else. 12 meters. Checkpoint consisting of 3 personnel. Observation made at 1340 hours local, no compromise. Continued to objective. The CIA analyst who read that line read it 3 times. Then he wrote in the margin, in his own handwriting, a single word. How? No answer came back. None was offered. The file simply continued, in its clipped and factual and utterly impenetrable way, describing 4 days of operations that should not have been possible in terms that gave no indication that the men conducting them considered them to be anything other than routine. Somewhere in the valley, 230 Taliban fighters continued their day entirely unaware that they were being watched by men they would never see, who were already planning how to get out. Getting out was always the part that killed you. That was the operational truth that every Special Forces soldier learned early and carried always. The knowledge that insertion was the controllable variable and extraction was where the mathematics turned against you. Going in, you chose the timing, the route, the conditions. Coming out, the enemy had 4 days to change the ground, to move the pieces, to alter the patterns that you had spent your time inside memorizing. Coming out, the valley that you had learned to move through in darkness was a different valley from the one you had entered, because knowledge of a place is not the same as ownership of it, and ownership of it had always belonged to someone else. The staff sergeant knew this better than most. He had planned the extraction with the same methodical attention he had given the approach, which meant he had planned 3 versions of it: the primary route, the alternate, and the emergency option, which was not really a plan so much as a set of principles for surviving long enough to reach a position from which an emergency extraction could be requested, and which he had described to his 3 patrol members in the flatly practical language of a man who wanted them to understand that the emergency option existed without wanting them to think about it more than necessary. The extraction was scheduled for the 4th night, 0300 hours. Same method as insertion: helicopter, fast rope in reverse, a platform that would hover for 90 seconds and no longer regardless of what was happening on the ground below it. 90 seconds. The pilots had their own survival calculations to make, and those calculations did not include remaining stationary over a Taliban-controlled valley for longer than the mission parameters allowed. On the morning of the 4th day, the primary extraction route was compromised, not by anything the patrol had done. The Taliban unit in the valley had received a resupply convoy overnight, a development that the signals intelligence had not predicted and the human source network had not reported, and the route of that convoy had established a pattern of movement along the primary extraction corridor that made it unusable. Not impassable. Unusable. There is a difference. Impassable means the physical terrain prevents movement. Unusable means that using it would require accepting a probability of compromise that exceeded the acceptable threshold, and the staff sergeant's acceptable threshold was not the same as the American planner's acceptable threshold, which is to say it was lower, which is to say he was willing to accept more risk than they were, but not that specific risk at that specific time. He switched to the alternate. The alternate added 2 kilometers to the extraction route and required the patrol to pass through a section of the valley's eastern perimeter that the imagery had shown as densely vegetated and which the staff sergeant had assessed during his pre-mission study as offering sufficient concealment for movement in darkness. What the imagery had not shown, because imagery does not show everything and the things it doesn't show are precisely the things that matter most, was that the vegetation in the eastern perimeter was home to a series of compounds that the Taliban used for equipment storage, and that these compounds were not unoccupied at night. The patrol discovered this at 0130 hours 90 minutes before the extraction window. They were 400 meters into the alternate route when the lead scout stopped. No signal, no sound. You simply stopped. The way a man stops when something in the information reaching him through his senses has changed in a way that his conscious mind hasn't yet processed but his body has already acted on. The patrol went still behind him, 4 men, 60 pounds of equipment each, absolutely motionless in vegetation that was thicker than the imagery had suggested and darker than the moonlight made comfortable. 30 meters ahead, a door opened. The light that came through it was faint. A lamp, probably, oil or battery. But in the darkness of the eastern perimeter it was enough to change everything. A figure stepped out, stood. The staff sergeant, from his position 4 meters behind the lead scout, could see the figure clearly enough to assess. Armed, alert, moving with the specific unhurried purpose of a man performing a routine task rather than responding to a perceived threat. They had not been heard. The figure moved along the outside wall of the compound, stopped at the corner and lit a cigarette. The smell of the smoke reached the patrol on the light night air with the particular clarity that smell achieves in cold darkness, sharp and immediate and oddly domestic against the operational reality of 4 men lying in vegetation 30 meters away trying to become part of the ground. The staff sergeant did not move. This was the thing that separated what these men did from what most men could do. Not the physical capability, though. The physical capability was real and had been built through years of training that most human bodies would not survive. Not the tactical knowledge, though. The tactical knowledge was encyclopedic and immediate and available without conscious retrieval. It was this, the ability to be completely still for as long as stillness was required. Not the stillness of paralysis, the stillness of absolute control. The body's every instinct saying move, respond, act, and the mind declining the invitation with the calm authority of long practice. The figure smoked. 4 men did not breathe. The cigarette lasted 7 minutes. The staff sergeant knew because he counted. Not seconds. He had moved past counting seconds in situations like this years ago. But breaths, slow, controlled, deliberate breaths that kept the body supplied with what it needed, while giving nothing away to the darkness around it. He counted breaths the way a diver counts depth, as a way of maintaining orientation in an environment that offered no other reference points. The figure finished the cigarette, stood for another 2 minutes, then went back inside and closed the door. The light disappeared. The patrol waited 8 more minutes without moving. Then the lead scout's hand came up, 2 fingers extended, and they moved. But the eastern perimeter was longer than the alternate route plan had accounted for, and there were more compounds than the imagery had shown. And the extraction window was now 63 minutes away, and the helicopter would not wait, and the staff sergeant was doing mathematics in his head that were coming back with answers he did not like. He pressed on anyway, because there was no version of stopping that ended well, and because the men behind him had not come this far to be collected by the emergency option, and because somewhere above this valley an American helicopter was already airborne and already counting down to a 90-second window that did not negotiate and did not extend and did not care what was happening on the ground below it. 41 minutes. The next compound was 20 meters ahead, and this one had a dog. A dog changes everything. It is the one variable that no amount of training fully prepares you for. Not because experienced operators don't know about dogs. They know about dogs the way they know about tripwires and pressure plates and all the other things that end operations without warning. But because a dog operates outside the framework that human sentries can be managed within. A human sentry has patterns, has a rotation, has moments of inattention that can be mapped and exploited, has, above all else, the limitation of human senses operating in darkness. The dog has none of those limitations. The lead scout had heard it before he saw it. A low sound, not yet a bark. The preliminary vocalization of an animal that has registered something on the edge of its awareness and has not yet decided what to do with the information. That sound, in that context, in that darkness, was one of the most dangerous sounds a man in the staff sergeant's position could hear. Not because it meant discovery, because it meant the next 15 seconds would determine everything. And the outcome of those 15 seconds was the one thing in the entire operation that was not within his control. He could not train the dog. He could not predict it. He could not negotiate with it or deceive it or outmaneuver it the way he had outmaneuvered every human obstacle the valley had placed between his patrol and the extraction point. The dog would either settle or it wouldn't. And the difference between those two outcomes was not something any amount of operational experience could reliably influence. The patrol went flat, not crouched, flat. 4 men pressing themselves into the vegetation with the specific deliberateness of people who understood that the difference between being seen and not being seen was sometimes measured in centimeters of elevation above the ground. The lead scout's face was against the earth. The staff sergeant could feel the cold of the soil through his clothing, could smell the particular combination of dust and vegetation and something organic beneath it, the smell of ground that has not been disturbed and very much wants to continue not being disturbed. The dog's sound changed. It moved from the preliminary register into something more committed, a sustained low vocalization that carried the specific quality of an animal that has made a decision about the thing it has sensed and is in the process of acting on that decision. Somewhere inside the compound, a man's voice said something sharp and brief. The dog's vocalization changed again, pulled back toward uncertainty by the human intervention, but did not stop. 28 minutes to the extraction window. The staff sergeant ran the options in the way he had been trained to run them, which is to say rapidly and without sentiment. The dog was the problem. The dog could be solved in one of 3 ways. The first way was patience. Wait for the animal to lose interest, which required time the patrol did not have. The second way was movement. Continue moving and accept the probability that the dog would escalate, which would wake the compound and potentially the adjacent compounds and turn the extraction corridor into something entirely different from what it needed to be. The third way was the one he did not want to use, because using it would produce a sound and a smell that would achieve the opposite of everything the patrol had spent 4 days working to preserve. He chose patience, and then the dog made the choice for him. It came around the corner of the compound at a low run, not barking, not yet, but moving with the focused directional energy of an animal that has resolved its uncertainty and is now investigating its conclusion. It was moving directly toward the lead scout's position. The lead scout did not move. The staff sergeant could see him from 4 meters back, a shape in the vegetation absolutely still, and he could see the dog closing the distance between them with the unhurried confidence of an animal on its own ground at night. 15 meters. 10. Weak Allen's apation, Donnelly a foe. The staff sergeant's hand moved to his sidearm, not drawing it, just placing his hand on it, because the calculus of the next few seconds included a version of events in which the choice was between the sound of a dog and the sound of something worse, and he needed to be positioned to make that choice in the time available, which was measured now in single seconds rather than minutes. The lead scout did something then that no training manual prescribes and no debrief has ever fully explained to the CIA analysts who reviewed the contact report afterwards. He did not move, he did not make a sound, he did not reach for a weapon or a piece of equipment or anything that the rational analysis of the situation would suggest as a response to a dog closing to contact range in a Taliban-controlled valley 40 minutes from an extraction window. He exhaled, slowly, completely. A long, controlled breath released into the cold night air in a way that was not quite a sound and not quite silence, but something between the two. A presence, an acknowledgement, a communication in a register that exists below the threshold of human language, but apparently not below the threshold of whatever the lead scout understood about the animal moving toward him. The dog stopped, 4 meters away. Close enough that the staff sergeant could see its shape clearly in the darkness, could see the specific quality of its stillness, the way its head was angled. It stood there for a period of time that the staff sergeant later recorded in his debrief as approximately 45 seconds and which felt, by every subjective measure available to a man lying in vegetation with his hand on a weapon he very much did not want to use, considerably longer than that. Then it turned around and walked back to the compound. No bark, no escalation, No roused sentry emerging with a weapon and a lamp to investigate what his dog had found. Just an animal that had gone to the edge of something it didn't fully understand and decided, for reasons that no analyst at Langley would ever be able to satisfactorily explain, that whatever was in the vegetation was not worth the full commitment of its attention. The compound door did not open. The patrol waited 4 minutes. Then the lead scout's hand came up and they moved. And this time they moved faster than they had moved at any point in the 4 days, because there were now 19 minutes to the extraction window and the helicopter did not wait and the mathematics had stopped being comfortable some time ago. The extraction point was 600 meters away. They covered it in 11 minutes. The staff sergeant was the last man out of the vegetation and onto the open ground of the landing zone. And as he crossed from cover into the exposed plateau, he did the thing that men in his position do without deciding to do it. He looked back once at the valley behind him, at the darkness of it, at the 230 men inside it who had spent 4 days entirely unaware of what had been moving through their operational space. He looked for 3 seconds. Then he turned away and did not look back again. Above him, right on time, he heard the helicopter. The helicopter was a British aircraft with a British crew, and it came in without lights. That detail mattered. An American crew, operating under American rules of engagement in that theater at that time, would have had navigation lights on during the approach. Protocol, safety, the institutional preference of a military organization large enough that the cost of individual losses registers differently than it does in an organization of the SAS's size. The British crew flew dark, which added risk to the approach and removed it from everything else. And the staff sergeant noted it in his debrief without comment because it was simply what he had expected, and expectation of professional competence is not something the regiment tends to annotate. The platform held its hover at 40 feet. 30 seconds into the 90-second window, all 4 men were ascending. The staff sergeant went last, the way patrol commanders always go last. And the sensation of leaving the ground, the specific physical transition from the solidity of Earth that has been for 4 days, the only reliable thing in the operational environment, registered somewhere below conscious thought as a change of state that the body notices before the mind catches up with it. He was up. He was on the aircraft. The valley was below him and receding, and the helicopter was already banking away into the darkness before his hands had finished securing to the airframe. Nobody spoke. That was the other thing the American liaison officer who later debriefed the patrol noted in his own report, in a section that he titled simply Atmosphere. He had debriefed many special operations units in many theaters over a long career. He had a framework for how operators behaved in the immediate aftermath of extraction, the specific combination of adrenaline release and exhaustion, and the particular social dynamic of men who have shared something extreme and are now in the process of returning to a world that does not share their frame of reference. He knew what that looked like. He had seen it many times. This was different. The 4 men sat in the aircraft and said nothing for the 40-minute flight back to the forward operating base. And the nothing they said was not the silence of exhaustion or shock or the processing of trauma. It was, the liaison officer wrote, the silence of men who had already finished with what had just happened and had moved on to whatever came next, as though the valley, and the 4 days, and the 230 men who had never known they were there, had already been filed in whatever internal system these men used for storing operational experience, and the filing was complete, and there was simply nothing left to say about it. The debrief began 3 hours after extraction. The British debrief was conducted internally by the squadron's own intelligence officer and lasted 4 hours. The American liaison officer was present for the final 90 minutes, which was the portion that dealt with the intelligence product rather than the operational methodology, the what rather than the how, because the how was not something the British side was offering to share in any detail that an Allied officer's presence would be required to capture. The intelligence product was, by the assessment of every analyst who subsequently reviewed it, exceptional. That word, exceptional, appears in 3 separate CIA documents referring to the same material, which is notable because CIA analytical products are not given to superlatives. The culture of the organization runs toward precision and qualification, toward the careful acknowledgement of uncertainty, toward language that conveys confidence levels rather than absolute judgments. When 3 separate analysts, working independently, reach for the same superlative to describe the same material, it means the material has done something to their professional framework that their professional framework does not have a more precise word for. The intelligence identified 17 specific individuals within the valley's Taliban structure, with names, physical descriptions, patterns of movement, and in 4 cases personal details, family connections, medical conditions, financial arrangements, that could only have been obtained through direct human observation at close range over an extended period. It mapped the valley's defensive infrastructure with a precision that the satellite imagery, reviewed alongside it, could not match. It identified 3 separate cache locations, 2 command nodes, and a logistics network that connected the valley to 2 other operational areas in a way that the existing intelligence picture had not previously shown. It also contained something that none of the analysts had expected. Buried in the appendices of the patrol's intelligence report, filed under the heading Incidental Observations, was a 12-paragraph assessment of the Taliban unit's morale, internal command dynamics, and operational intentions over the coming 30 days. Not signals intelligence, not source reporting, direct observation. The staff sergeant had spent 4 days inside the valley and had come out with a picture of the human interior of the enemy force, the tensions, the hierarchies, the points of friction and the points of cohesion, that no technical collection platform could have produced, and that no human intelligence network operating at a safe distance could have developed in 4 days. The CIA station chief in Kabul read that appendix twice. Then he sent a message to Langley that was 3 sentences long. The first sentence described what the patrol had produced. The second sentence described the conditions under which it had been produced. The third sentence asked a question that Langley, despite the considerable resources at its disposal, was not able to answer to his satisfaction. The question was, how do you train someone to do this? The answer that came back, after 2 weeks and several internal consultations, was carefully worded and ultimately unhelpful. It acknowledged the exceptional nature of the product. It noted the long history and distinctive selection and training philosophy of the unit concerned. It observed that the SAS model, while clearly effective, was not directly transferable to the American Special Operations context given differences in organizational scale, doctrine, and institutional culture. It did not answer the question, because the question didn't have an answer that fit in a document. The answer lived in 9 years of operational experience carried in the body of a 34-year-old staff sergeant from South Wales who had been told at 16 that he wasn't university material. It lived in the specific quality of stillness that a lead scout had found in himself at 4 meters from a dog in a Taliban valley at 2 in the morning. It lived in the space between an order and the judgment about how to execute it. A space that the American military system, with its doctrine and its oversight and its vast and well-funded apparatus of command and control, had spent decades systematically narrowing. The SAS had spent decades doing the opposite. The file went back into its drawer at Langley. The 11-year wait before anyone opened it again was not bureaucratic neglect. It was the institutional equivalent of standing in front of something you don't have the framework to understand and deciding, for the time being, to leave it alone. The valley in Helmand continued its existence, unaware of what had passed through it. The staff sergeant was already in another theater. The intelligence product from the Valley operation reached the desk of a 2-star American general at Bagram Airfield on a Tuesday morning in late October 2001. He read it once, set it down, read it again. Then he did something that his staff had not seen him do in the 14 months he had held his current command. He picked up the phone and called the British Special Forces liaison officer personally, bypassing his own J2, his chief of staff, and the established inter-allied communication protocol that existed precisely to prevent senior officers from making direct calls that created obligations the institutional machinery hadn't yet processed. The liaison officer, a British lieutenant colonel who had spent time in the regiment before moving into a staff role and who therefore understood both worlds well enough to move between them without losing fluency in either, took the call and listened to what the general had to say, which was brief and direct in the way that 2-star generals are brief and direct when they have decided that brevity is more useful than rank. He wanted to know if the patrol could go back in. The liaison officer explained, with the particular diplomatic patience of a man who had answered versions of this question many times before, that the patrol's availability was not a function of willingness. Willingness was not a variable that entered the equation on the British side, but of operational necessity and the judgment of the squadron commander about what the mission required and what the men who had just completed 4 days in a Taliban valley needed before they were tasked again. The general asked how long that would take. The liaison officer said he would make inquiries. What he knew, and did not say, was that the staff sergeant had already submitted a preliminary assessment of re-entry options to his squadron commander the previous evening, less than 24 hours after extraction, while the American liaison officer had still been working through the debrief notes. The assessment was 4 pages long, It identified 2 modifications to the original approach that would reduce the probability of compromise on a second insertion. It noted 3 changes in the valley's pattern of life that the patrol had observed in the final 48 hours of the operation, and which suggested a shift in the Taliban unit's operational tempo that created a window of opportunity unlikely to remain open for more than 10 days. It concluded with a single line that the squadron commander later described, in a private conversation that was not recorded officially, as the most concise expression of the SAS operational philosophy he had encountered in 20 years of service. The line read, "Ready when required." That was it. No qualification, no request for additional resources, no assessment of personal risk or acknowledgement of the physical condition of 4 men who had spent 4 days on minimal sleep and minimal rations in a hostile valley with 230 enemy fighters and a dog. Ready when required. As though the 4 days had been a morning's work and the question of whether to go back was no more complex than whether the intelligence justified the tasking, which of course it did, which meant the answer was already implicit in the question. The general got his answer through the liaison officer 48 hours later. The patrol would go back in. Different entry point, modified extraction protocol, adjusted timeline based on the staff sergeant's assessment of the operational window. The American side provided updated satellite imagery, a revised signals intelligence package, and a close air support allocation that the British accepted without comment and, as the liaison officer later noted in his own private memoir, almost certainly never intended to use. The second insertion happened on a night when the weather closed in across the valley from the northwest, bringing low cloud and reduced visibility that grounded most of the American aviation assets in theater, and which the Taliban unit in the valley used as cover to move a significant portion of their fighting strength to a forward position 3 kilometers east. The patrol went in anyway. This was the part of the file that the CIA analyst who finally read it in 2003 found most difficult to process. Not the first operation, with its impossible movement and its exceptional intelligence product and its 45 seconds of stillness in front of a dog in the dark. The second operation, because the second operation happened in conditions that were objectively worse than the first, with an enemy force that had partially repositioned and therefore presented an altered and less predictable pattern of movement, in weather that reduced the patrol's own visibility along with everyone else's, without the advantage of 4 days of prior observation that had made the first operation possible, and it produced better intelligence than the first one. The analyst sat with that fact for a long time. He had a framework for understanding exceptional performance. He had seen it in other units, in other theaters, in the work of operators whose files he had reviewed over a 15-year career. He understood that elite training produced elite outcomes, and that the selection processes of the world's premier special operations units were designed to identify and develop human beings capable of performance that sat outside the normal distribution of military effectiveness. What he did not have a framework for was improvement under degraded conditions. Every model he had, every analytical framework he had built through years of studying special operations outcomes, predicted that performance would decrease as conditions worsened. That was not a controversial proposition. It was the baseline assumption of every operational planning process in every military on Earth. You planned for degradation. You built in margins for the inevitable reduction in effectiveness that adverse conditions produced. You accepted that the gap between what men could do in optimal conditions and what they could do when everything was going wrong was a fixed and fundamental feature of human operational performance. The SAS file suggested otherwise, not just in these 2 operations. The analyst, once he had clearance for the full file, found 11 other operations in the same category, unexplained outcome, and in 9 of them the pattern repeated. Conditions worsened, performance improved, not marginally, substantially, as though the degradation of external conditions somehow released a capacity that optimal conditions actually suppressed. As though these men operated better when the environment gave them less to work with, not more. He wrote 4 pages of analysis attempting to explain this phenomenon and deleted all 4 pages because none of them said anything that he felt confident defending in front of the people who would read them. Then he wrote 1 paragraph. It said that the unit's performance characteristics under degraded conditions appeared to reflect a training and selection philosophy that deliberately optimized for adverse circumstances rather than ideal ones, producing operators whose baseline operational state was calibrated to difficulty rather than comfort. and that this represented a fundamental philosophical difference from the American special operations model that could not be addressed through equipment, budget, or doctrinal adjustment alone. He paused before the last sentence. Then he wrote it anyway. It would require, he wrote, a different kind of soldier, and a different kind of institution willing to produce him, and a different answer to the question of what elite military performance actually is and where it actually comes from. He submitted the analysis on a Friday afternoon. On Monday morning, it came back with a single annotation from his supervisor, written in the margin beside the final paragraph in the same handwriting that had once written the word "how" in the margin of the staff sergeant's debrief. The annotation said, "Agreed. Not actionable." The file went back in the drawer. The staff sergeant by that point was somewhere else entirely. The somewhere else was never specified in any document the analyst could access. That was the nature of the file. It had edges but no center, boundaries but no complete picture. The way certain classified materials are structured deliberately, not to conceal a single secret but to prevent the assembly of a complete narrative that would be more revealing than any of its individual components. You could read everything in the file and know a great deal about what had happened and understand almost nothing about how, and the how was the part that mattered. The part that the two-star general and the station chief and the analyst himself had been reaching for from the beginning and had never quite managed to close their hands around. The staff sergeant's service record, the portions of it that existed in accessible form, ended in 2006. Not with a discharge, not with a retirement. It simply stopped producing entries in the places where entries were normally made, which in the world of special operations is itself a kind of information. It means a man has moved into a space where the normal administrative machinery of military service no longer applies, where the paper trail that follows every soldier from enlistment to discharge has been deliberately interrupted because the work being done does not benefit from documentation, and the people doing it have long since passed the point where documentation was the primary way their value was understood. The lead scout, the man with the dog, the man whose exhaled breath in a Taliban valley had bought 4 men, 19 minutes in a helicopter and everything that followed, was mentioned once more in the accessible record, a training report, undated, from an instructor assessment conducted somewhere in the United Kingdom, at a location identified only by a grid reference that placed it in the upland terrain of an area used regularly by the regiment for continuation training. The report assessed his performance across a range of skills and gave numerical scores for each of them except one. The final category on the assessment form was headed situational awareness, and the space where a number should have been was blank. In the margin beside the blank space, the assessing instructor had written 3 words, "Does not apply." The CIA analyst read those 3 words and understood them immediately and completely, which was unusual because the file had not given him that experience very often. Does not apply. Not that the lead scout's situational awareness was perfect, or exceptional, or beyond the scale of measurement, though any of those things might also have been true. Does not apply because the category itself, situational awareness as a discrete skill that could be assessed and scored and compared against a benchmark, was the wrong framework for what the man actually had. What he had was not a heightened version of a normal human capacity. It was something that had been trained and selected and developed over years until it had become qualitatively different from the thing it had started as, different enough that the measuring instrument designed for the original thing no longer produced useful data when applied to what it had become. The analyst thought about that for a long time. He thought about the valley, about 4 men moving through 230 enemies for 4 days without being detected. About the 90 minutes it had taken them to cross ground that should have taken 4 hours. About 45 seconds of stillness in front of a dog at 2 in the morning in the dark. About the second operation, conducted in worse conditions, producing better results. About the final paragraph of his own analysis, the one his supervisor had annotated with "agreed, not actionable." The 2 words that meant the institution understood what it was looking at, and had decided that understanding it was as far as it was prepared to go. He thought about the careers advisor in South Wales who had told a 16-year-old that he wasn't university material. He thought about what that 16-year-old had done instead. The file contained one final document that he had not expected to find. It was not an intelligence assessment or an operational report or an inter-allied communication. It was a transcript, partial and heavily redacted, of an informal conversation between the staff sergeant and a junior member of his patrol that had been recorded, apparently inadvertently, on a piece of equipment that had been left running after a formal debrief, sometime during the second operations planning phase. Most of the transcript was blacked out, What remained was 11 lines of conversation, of which 8 were redacted, leaving 3 legible exchanges separated by blocks of black. The first legible line was the junior patrol member's voice. He was asking apparently about the methodology for the valley approach, how the staff sergeant had identified the route that the analysts had missed, how he had known it was there when the imagery didn't show it. The staff sergeant's response was redacted. The next legible line was the junior patrol member again, apparently unsatisfied with whatever answer had been given, pressing for more detail, asking the question a different way, asking what he was supposed to look for, what the principle was, how you learned to see what the analysts couldn't see from their satellites and their frameworks and their accumulated institutional knowledge about how terrain and human behavior intersected. The staff sergeant's response to that question was also redacted. The final legible line was the staff sergeant's voice. It was not a response to a question. It appeared to be the end of a longer statement, the beginning of which was lost in the redaction. It was 7 words. You stop looking for what should be there. That was it. The end of the legible transcript, the end of the file. 7 words that the analyst read once and then sat with in the specific silence of a person who has been handed the answer to a question they have spent a long time asking and is now in the process of discovering that the answer, while complete, does not make the question smaller. It makes it larger. It opens rather than closes. It stands at the beginning of something rather than the end. You stop looking for what should be there. The analyst closed the file. He sat in his office at Langley on a Tuesday afternoon with the file closed on the desk in front of him and the question still open in his mind. The same question it had always been. The question the 2-star general had asked through the liaison officer and the station chief had asked in 3 sentences from Kabul and the instructor had left blank on an assessment form in the upland terrain of the United Kingdom. How do you train someone to do this? Outside his window, the ordinary world continued its ordinary business. Cars in the car park. A plane crossing the sky at altitude. Navigation lights blinking in the gray afternoon. People moving through their days with the specific quality of motion that belongs to people who are not currently lying still in hostile vegetation waiting for a dog to make a decision that will determine whether they live or die. The file went back in the drawer. The staff sergeant was already somewhere else. He was already looking.